was in university studying games, I was in a lecture and a strange debate broke out. One that I thought was categorically stupid. Is Among Us an MMO? For context, this was a module on MMOs, and we were each selecting one to play for the purposes of investigating how they engage with players, use monetization strategies, and so on. And this was during late 2020, so Among Us was very much still at the forefront of the culture. So, what do you think? Is Among Us an MMO? I mean, obviously not, right? But this argument raged on nonetheless. The pro-MMO argument being that of the three words that MMO stands for, massively multiplayer online, Among Us fits all three categories. It was indeed a multiplayer game that you played online, and in 2020 it certainly fit the definition of massive, even if you were limited to lobbies of just 10 players, so maybe there's something to it? Except that's not how genre definitions work, and we all know it. What those debaters are deliberately ignoring is that the term MMO does not just literally mean a massively multiplayer online game. It also encompasses a wide range of generally accepted mechanics that Among Us doesn't have. Persistent open worlds that players can explore together, guild systems to band players together, subscription fees or regular expansions that keep the player base paying for development, and server capacities that allow for a lot more than 10 people to play together at once. While this, to my mind, is enough to conclusively prove that Among Us is not an MMO, that list does have a problem, because I'm sure almost all of you could name a game that most reasonable people would agree is an MMO, yet doesn't have at least one of the features I just listed. The thing is, MMO as a term was coined in an era that doesn't even remotely resemble the state of gaming today. It was first used around the early to mid-90s to describe a game like the Kingdom of Drakkar, as they developed beyond the multi-user dungeon, or MUD games, that had existed up until that point. Over that decade, things would progress even further, with things like Ultima Online leading into the MMORPG genre coming to fruition, which would set the stage for World of Warcraft to take the world by storm several years later. Those early games are, by and large, where we get these broad descriptors of what defines an MMO. And even then, if we're being honest, most people in modern gaming parlance probably just got it from WoW alone. But if there's one thing that the last couple of decades of game development have taught us, it's that we're long past the era where games can be neatly drawn into their little boxes, and the lines as to where one genre ends and the next begins grow fuzzier by the day. And what better example of that than every indie developer's favourite genre term that we all still use despite agreeing it's mostly meaningless at this point, roguelike. To take the literal approach, a roguelike is a game that is like Rogue. By that definition, any game released after about 1985 can't possibly count as a roguelike. But much like MMO, the term isn't used literally in the modern day. So, what are the key features of a roguelike? Well, it has randomised and or procedurally generated levels that are designed to be played over and over. And that's it. No, really, that's it. That is the only thing your game needs to be described as a roguelike in the modern day. I'm really not kidding. Basically everyone would agree that Balatro is a roguelike, right? It's the second most popular descriptor on its Steam page. But what features does it share with Rogue? It is literally just that you play it over and over. Hell, it's barely even randomised. Each boss is chosen at random from a set pool, sure, but the threshold to win each level is fixed based on your difficulty level. The properly random elements come in with the shot, which is a much later innovation on the genre. And this is true across every indie roguelike that drops on Steam. If a game describes itself using that term, you learn about precisely one of its mechanics. Outside of that, it could be a platformer, a deck builder, a shooter, a hack and slash, literally anything. So, does this mean roguelike is completely worthless as a genre definition? Well, no, I don't think so. Because although it only defines one thing, that one thing is a very difficult concept to describe otherwise. Randomised levels designed to be repeatedly played as the player's skill level increases to overcome greater challenge doesn't exactly roll off the tongue when you're trying to sell someone on a game. However, if you say roguelike, most people who regularly play games will understand the concepts you're trying to convey. This is the same reason the similarly maligned term Souls-like has stuck around. Because before everyone started emulating Dark Souls, there wasn't any broad umbrella term for a game that emphasises difficulty and punishes the player with scarce checkpoints and retrieving their corpse when they die, because there didn't need to be one until about a decade ago. It's most obvious with roguelike and Souls-like, but there are a lot of genre definitions nowadays that can't stand on their own. Instead, they act more like adjectives that modify the descriptor of another genre. People don't describe a game as a roguelike on its own nowadays. We instead have terms like roguelike deck builder, or Souls-like Metroidvania, which, now I mention it, Metroidvania is another term that could fit into this category, as it combines two series that are branched off in very different directions since the term was originally coined. Ultimately, a term wouldn't survive if it were completely meaningless, no matter how much it irks people. Even a term as broad as open world. Sure, it may not actually tell you anything meaningful about how the game will play, but it does tell you one piece of crucial information about how it was designed, which has value. However, I can't quite say that for every term that exists in modern gaming discourse, as there is one genre that has always pissed me off for how vague it is. Think about the early Assassin's Creed games. I'm talking like Assassin's Creed 1 through 3 sort of era. What genre terms would you use to describe these games? At the time, they were generally just referred to as open world games, which was fine in 2010, but feels a little vague and empty now. While they do have some gear progression elements, calling them RPGs feels like a bit of a stretch. And while they do emphasise stealth mechanics, they're far from full-on stealth games. They're hard to fit into any one box, or at least out of the boxes we already have at our disposal. So instead, we decided to make a new box that forever ruined how we talk about AAA games. Because the term that probably popped into your head to describe these games is action-adventure. And that's just what a video game is. I mean, there are always some exceptions to the rule, but by and large, every video game ever made contains some degree of both action and adventure. That's kind of the whole reason the medium became popular in the first place, because people want to experience both of those things. It just became this catch-all term for companies like Ubisoft, who churn out endless open-world slop and couldn't think of a unique way to sell it. Just look at the Game Awards. It's had a Best Action Adventure category for 8 years, and it's the biggest joke of a category I've ever seen. Just look at the nominations for 2024. We have a 3D platformer, a top-down puzzle platformer, a survival horror, a 2D Metroidvania, and an open-world action game. How on earth are any of these comparable in what's supposed to be the gaming Oscars? And when you think about what games didn't make the cut that year, it's all the more confusing. What precludes other Game of the Year nominees like Black Myth Wukong and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth from being action-adventure titles? Do they not contain both of those things? Of course they do. But as I say, it's just a meaningless catch-all term that can be stuffed with absolutely anything you want. And so the Game Awards can use it to buff out their numbers, shove in a few more nominees, and bump up Astro Bot's award count for the sheer bloody hell of it. But okay, the Game Awards are rarely worth getting this worked up about. But it's an example of how genre definitions can be pushed upon us by corporate overlords that rule this industry, when they don't feel like being creative. And how, over the years, this has gradually deteriorated the state of discourse, to the point where people don't even really use genre definitions when describing games anymore. Like, think about it. How do you recommend a game to someone when you're convincing them to play it? Do you use terms like roguelike and action-adventure? Or do you instead find another game that is a good comparison? Ideally one that you know the person you're talking to likes, so that they might want to play it. This is the reason the term Souls-like exists in the first place, because enough people started recommending games to people by saying it's like Dark Souls. Hell, it even became a meme to call something the Dark Souls of its genre because of how much people overused it to describe any game that emphasises difficulty. When trying to describe anything, we latch onto points of comparison because it makes it so much easier when there are clear points of reference that you can be confident the person you're talking to will understand, and oh, would you look at that? We've just invented genre definitions again. Because that's the thing about this topic. Get mad about the terms you don't like all you want, but people literally don't know how to stop using them, whether they realise it or not. Sure, maybe you recommend an action game to a friend by saying it felt like Nier Automata, Or you got them into a squad-based tactics game by saying it was like XCOM. But if enough people were to start doing that, it would become a new genre term in a heartbeat. Hell, I know people who do just refer to squad-based tactics games as XCOM-likes. Sure, action-adventure sucks as a term, but would I really prefer they be called Assassin's Creed-likes, or whatever representative you choose? Ubislop is pretty funny, but people would never come up with such a negative-leaning term for a popular genre, right? Right? Friendslop. That's the latest genre term that seems to have arisen, and it feels unnecessarily mean. If you're unaware, this term applies to a lot of the party-based multiplayer games that have been popular with streamers over the past few years. Things like Lethal Company, Repo, and Peak are some of the leading lights in the genre, but naturally these sorts of games have spawned a lot of copycats trying to bait streamers and ape their success. These games all give players a simple premise, a few things to mess up their objective, and let people scream at, and then lets them pile on with as many friends as they like. And inevitably, that kind of game is always going to be enjoyable when played with friends, regardless of how shallow the core gameplay loop actually is. That's where we get the term Friendslop, as the game's only ever designed to be played with friends, as if you were to try to play them solo, you'd probably find them quite dull. And while I see why some people find the genre a little lazy and derisive, I still find Friendslop as a term a bit too mean, because the fact is these games are genuinely very enjoyable when played with a few friends. And that's the core experience they were designed for, so what does it matter if the single player experience is boring? Saying that Peak sucks because the single player experience isn't fun is like saying that Call of Duty sucks because there's no option to sit down and talk it out with your opponents. It's just not that sort of game, and it shouldn't try to be. Plus, there are countless other games, AAA games at that, where you could apply the phrase, only fun with friends. Sea of Thieves is the main one that comes to mind. When you're a crew of 4 running a giant frigate through the seas, it's a brilliant experience. But play it alone and you'll be stuck potting about from empty island to empty island on a glorified dinghy before the bigger boats will come and mug you for your rum money. Sounds very Friendslop to me. But still, now the term Friendslop is in my head, I have been using it, even when I have a distaste for the term, because I can't think of a better one that everyone would immediately understand. Party-based adventure? Co-op silly them up? Deliberately janky physics engine the musical? I got nothing. As stupid as that term is, Friendslop manages to convey so much meaning in just 2 syllables. And I have to admit that is impressive. And that circles back around to my original point, which is that if you're taking genre definitions literally, then you're fundamentally misunderstanding how they're used in modern games discourse. Because, yeah, if you've been in the gaming space a while, you'll know that basically no roguelike ever is actually like Rogue, or what set of mechanics people are referring to when they say a game has Souls-like elements. Does a Metroidvania mean that the game is guaranteed to play anything like a Metroid or Castlevania game? No, it just means that it'll have a large interconnected map that branches out in multiple directions as you progress. And these aren't just my few cherry-picked examples. If you're taking genre definitions entirely literally, then even some of the most common ones cease to make any sense. While something purely descriptive like first-person shooter is pretty solid, what about RPG? Role-playing game? When you actually break that down, it's exactly the same problem as action-adventure, right? Basically every video game ever sees you playing some sort of role. That's what fiction is. And when you add modifiers to that one, it gets even worse. JRPG is a Japanese RPG, which feels like it should have a very strict and clear-cut definition, and yet we all know of great JRPGs that never went anywhere near Japan during development. And heck, there are a handful of Japanese-made RPGs that would feel more at home under the Western RPG banner. But it's fine, because we all understand what JRPG actually means. It's referring to a generally accepted collection of mechanics, which is why no one really flinches at calling something like Clair Obscur Expedition 33 a JRPG, even when it was made by French developers. And then, in a macro sense, it's how we draw the line between certain games, and we understand why Skyrim is an RPG, while something like Assassin's Creed 2 isn't. despite having several RPG elements. Do you even have the slightest idea why Civilization is called a 4X strategy game? I don't, and you know what? I don't need to know, because I already have a complete understanding of what sort of gameplay experience I'm in for when someone identifies a game as a 4X strategy. And that is what makes genre definitions so useful, despite many of them being profoundly nonsensical. So, enjoy your Friendslop. Call any game with a hint of randomness a roguelike, and play those action-packed adventures to your heart's content. Just don't you dare call Among Us an MMO.